Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Ordinary meeting, Thursday, 27th of March, 2025, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, 20th of March, 2025 were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society. You will be stumped. Puzzling portrayals of inscriptions and antiquarian societies in the 18th and 19th centuries by Dr. Abigail Graham, FSA. Thanks for return for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 3rd of April, and then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear our paper. Our speaker this evening is our fellow Peter Cormack, not only a fellow, but also for many years the honorary curatorial advisor at Kelmscott Manor, William Morris's Oxfordshire home that belongs to the Society. Peter has been researching, writing and lecturing on post-medieval stained glass since the 1970s. He was formerly keeper of the William Morris Gallery in London, where he curated many exhibitions of the work of Morris and members of the arts and crafts movement, including pioneering displays of 19th and 20th century stained glass. He's been a research fellow at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and his book, Arts and Crafts Stained Glass, published in 2015 by the Paul Mellon Centre and Yale University Press, really was the first study of this type of stained glass. Most recently, his monograph, which you can see and buy outside if you wish, on stained glass artist by Charles J. Connick, was also published by Yale. He's going to talk to us this evening at his lecture, After Tiffany, how the British arts and crafts movement transformed American stained glass in the early 20th century. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, President, and good evening, fellows, affiliates, guests. If you go to any art museum in America with a significant decorative arts collection, there's a good chance that you'll see examples of stained glass by Louis Comfort Tiffany and his contemporaries. Inexplicably, however, it's virtually certain you'll see none of the American stained glass post-dating Tiffany, which is the subject of this lecture. This lacuna has significantly distorted the art historical canon in the field, and I believe it's also led to a dismal effect on the public understanding of the art form in America. The United States of America are no stranger to polarized views in politics, of course, and in matters of culture too. But in the early 1900s, the ostensibly serene world of stained glass was also, perhaps surprisingly, the forum for a stridently polemical debate among some Americans. On one side were the advocates of so-called American glass, i.e. windows made with opalescent glass, which you see on the screen here. On the left, John Lafarge, a window at Northeastern in Massachusetts, and two on the right by Tiffany. Opalescent glass, which was the innovative material developed by Lafarge and his rival Tiffany in the 1870s. On the other side of the debate were principally architects working in a modern Gothic idiom who rejected the overt pictorialism, lurid color effects, and deliberately light obscuring qualities of opalescent windows, and especially their un-architectonic character. I should say, if you don't know, then Tiffany windows are made of, and opalescent windows are made of a particular chemical composition of glass, which deliberately obscures the light. And that, of course, is in contrast to the translucency and transparency of the medieval material, as used principally in Europe, of course. To get a flavor of this debate, I'm going to quote the words of two prominent Boston-based ecclesiastical architects. First, on the left, Charles Collins of the architectural partnership Allen and Collins, who are probably best known today for the Riverside Church in New York and also the Metropolitan Museum's Cloisters building. This is Charles Collins writing in about 1912. It has sometimes seemed almost necessary to organize an order of stained glass gunmen bound by the most terrible oaths secretly to do away with the stained glass horrors which have obstructed our attempts at improvement. There is hardly any one of the older churches which has not this insidious growth somewhere in its anatomy. The figure on the right is Ralph Adams Cram, the leading American church architect of the early 20th century. He expressed himself in more moderate but equally forthright words, writing in 1907, "Religion and art join in the demand for stained glass that shall be good from the standpoint of art and religion. The day of forgeries, shams, sentimental substitutes, and patented tour de force has passed away, and the field is clear for a great restoration which shall be strong with the heritage of the past, vital with the impulses of the present day." In this lecture, I want to examine some of the critical factors that influence the change of taste that in the early 20th century transformed the style and techniques of American stained glass away from the opalescent method of Tiffany and Farge and towards one that, while returning to the craft's ancient traditions, at the same time owed much to developments brought about by the arts and crafts movement here in Britain. And to set the scene and to introduce the context in which the stained glass windows were installed, here are some examples of American modern Gothic architecture. Top left is the Graduate College at Princeton University by Ralph Adams Cram, and also Cram's splendid Euclid Avenue Presbyterian Church in Cleveland, Ohio. And on the right, by Charles Collins, who was the other architect whom I quoted, second Congregational Church in West Newton in the Boston suburbs. As you'll see, these are very ambitious modern Gothic buildings. One of the great contrasts with the Gothic revival buildings here in Britain is that, one, there was a lot more money available in the 1900s when these buildings were being put up, and very often they had all their fixtures and furnishings designed largely by the architects or at their instigation, and all put in at about the same time. So you don't get the disparity that we often find in buildings in this country between various periods of stained glass and other furnishings. Well, in America, in the 1900s, there were very few examples of medieval stained glass in museums. Now, if you go to any of the great American museums, you will find panels of stained glass from the 12th, 13th century onwards. But there were very few of these in America. The great collecting thing didn't start really till after the First World War, not least because of the damage done to French cathedrals during the Great War. American collectors acquired that glass. So any American designer who wished to design in the medieval tradition had to rely not on studying actual examples, but on the work of historians, and in particular, British historians. And I illustrate on the screen the work of three of them. Two were fellows of this society. On the left is Charles Winston, one of the illustrations from his book, Hints on Glass Painting, came out in 1847, reprinted in the 1860s. In the middle, the work of Nathaniel Westlake, his great 4-volume History of Design in Painted Glass between 1881 and 1894. And on the right, another important book by Louis F. Day, himself a stained glass designer as well as a historian, Windows, a book about stained glass, published in 1897 and subsequently reprinted. These books were enormously important, enormously influential for the new school of American stained glass artists, not least because, of course, apart from the Winston, which was hand-colored, the illustrations, the others were all in black and white. That therefore emphasized the importance of the leading and the graphic element within medieval stained glass. And that, as we'll see, is a particularly important feature. Another very important development here in Britain, which was to have a huge influence in the United States, were the technical developments by members of the arts and crafts movement here. And I illustrate top left Edward Schroeder Pryor, also a fellow of the society, the great architect and architectural historian, who in the late 1880s developed the technique of making pieces of glass for stained glass, known as Early English slab glass, first used in Framlingham Parish Church in Suffolk for decorative glazing and in clear or tinted glass. It was made in bottles as opposed to the cylinder method of making sheet glass. These were blown into a bottle shape. And the other person I illustrate there is William J. Blencowe, a London glass blower and bottle blower and glass technician, who was the one who actually first created the slab glass that had been instigated by Edward Pryor. The diagram shows basically how you blow a bubble of glass into a mold, and as the air is blown in, certain parts of the glass are concentrated on the sides and the base, so you get, in the end, when it's cut into 5 slabs, you get a very uneven contoured surface. And of course, once color is applied to the glass, you get very uneven coloring as well. So top right, you'll see examples of slab glass, samples of slab glass. Those are the bases of bottles, and 2 of the side panels cut from one of these bottles in ruby glass and various shades of ruby glass, probably gold pink and gold ruby, gold being the mineral that's added to create the red color. Now, these developments were known to Ralph Adams Cram, who, with his architectural partner Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue, was a great Anglophile. They frequently came over to England. They were friendly with members of the British arts and crafts movement, people like C.R. Ashby and Henry Wilson. And Ralph Adams Cram, in particular, came to know and greatly admire the work of Christopher Whall, who was the leading figure in British arts and crafts stained glass of the generation after William Morris. His career began in the 1890s, and some of you may well know his most famous work, the windows in the Lady Chapel of Gloucester Cathedral, done from the late 1890s into the 1910s. And what you see on the left is a detail of one of Wall's windows at Gloucester with the figure of St. Chad. What is noticeable is the use, again, of this slab glass. It's very chunky, contoured surface, highly textured glass, and techniques such as acid etching applied to the glass, and also the very emphatic use of leading. Leading was very important because this very heavy glass, slab glass, required a lot of structural lead, but also artists such as Whall found that the lead was an important part of their graphic approach to design as well. One of Whall's particular innovations was to reject the sort of pseudo-architectural canopy work that's so often found in Gothic revival Victorian windows, and instead create canopies for the figure, as you see for St. Chad here, which were made out of foliage. So he would study oak leaves and various other natural, and you see Whall himself in the branches of a tree, almost embodying what he created in stained glass. And that emphasis upon nature, of course, was a very significant part of the arts and crafts movement. Now, Whall began teaching at the Royal College of Art and at the London County Council Central School of Arts and Crafts in the 1900s, and soon had many pupils and apprentices. And he produced a book in 1905, stained glass work, which became extremely influential in this country, used very widely throughout all the art schools, but also co-published in America at exactly the same time in 1905 by Appletons of New York, and indeed reprinted in 1914 before there were any English reprints. So it shows the influence of the book in the United States when it was published. You see the frontispiece there. Well, Ralph Adams Cram, having got to know Christopher Whall, asked him to design windows for churches that he was involved with. On the left is Whall's window at All Saints Ashmont in Dorchester in the Boston suburbs, dating from about 1907. And you'll see again, it's very similar in format to Whall's windows at Gloucester. And again, the foliate canopies in silvery glass, the use of a lot of leading and almost a sort of random pattern of slab glass used in the backgrounds of the figures. And on the right, you see perhaps the most impressive of Whall's schemes of windows in America at the Church of the Advent in Boston, again commissioned by Cram, the figure of St. John Chrysostom, representing the Orthodox Church, and a series of windows in the clerestory, the Advent, all of them depicting leaders of the early church. And particularly if you look at the purple glass in the base of the window and the deep blue glass behind St. Chrysostom's head, you can see this slab glass used very effectively, I think particularly because of the bright American light. There's quite a difference between the light in this country and the light in most of the USA. It tends to get brighter and brighter. So Whall, although he'd never traveled to the States, did understand this and was able to create windows that fully responded to the American light. Now, these window on the right, dating from 1909, was shipped over to America from Whall's studio, and there it was uncrated in the studio of the American firm that would install it in the Church of the Advent. And there was a young artist there called Charles J. Connick, who saw the window being uncrated, and they looked at it in the workshop, and he thought, this looks very crude, and the painting's all gritty, etc. He wasn't at all impressed. But then, when the windows were installed a few weeks later, he went back to the church and was profoundly impressed. When he saw them, as he said, glowing serenely and beautifully in the clerestory at the Advent, I understood then how tiny spots of light through areas of paint had illuminated entire windows in a gracious fashion, new to me, yet curiously true and good. I awoke to the charm of glassiness, and soon I glorified in the discovery of Christopher Whall. So it was, in many ways, the catalyst for the major change that was to come about. But before we go on to Connick and indeed Cram's experience with American glass painters, I'll talk first about Cram's efforts originally to find American artists who would work in the ancient medieval tradition. The first of these was William Willett of Pittsburgh at the time. And in Cram's Calvary Church in Pittsburgh, you see on the far left, Willett's work. It's clearly in some ways inspired by early French glass, the overall color scheme. But as you see, the figures are treated in a fairly academic way. And although Willett has used the format, the medallion format that one might find in early French glass, he's still essentially treating it as almost a mural space. On the right-hand side, the whole window and a detail from the liberal arts window, which is the very large window in the graduate college at Princeton University, which Cram designed. Now, Cram, in fact, wanted his protege, Charles Connick, whom I've just mentioned, to design this window, but the principal of the college had already decided to use William Willett. Willett, in fact, produced a design that was almost like a Tiffany window. Cram was furious with him and eventually forced Willett to add infinitely more lead to the window. And as a result, it's a great deal more successful. And he also specified the range of rich colors that you see there. So it's on the whole, quite a successful window, but he fell out with Willett and thereafter did not use Willett, who went on to have a successful career and did work with Cram's partner, Bertram Goodhue, particularly at West Point Chapel. But it was the end of his relationship with Ralph Adams Cram. Another designer whom Cram worked with at first, an American designer, was Bertram Goodhue's brother, Harry Eldridge Goodhue, who had, in fact, completely espoused the medieval tradition, having worked originally in opalescent glass, but in the early 1900s took up the use of antique glass, i.e. glass made in the medieval tradition, translucent, transparent glass, with rich coloring and using a lot of lead. And in fact, the best of Harry Eldridge's windows are very effective. On the left, St. Vincent Ferrer Catholic Church in New York City, a window of the Visitation. And on the right, the whole window and the detail of one in West Newton Unitarian Church, again in the Boston suburbs. The design was actually by George Hallowell, a painter who was one of Ralph Adams Cram's proteges. And you'll see how Goodhue is very much taking on board that English idea of using the leading and creating patterns in the leading in the background of the figure on the right, and also even in the costume of the figure, the sort of purple and white checkerboard pattern and the robes there. But it was, in the end, it was Charles J. Connick who was to be the most successful of Cram's stained glass collaborators, and without question, who was to become the leader of the craft in America, working in the medieval tradition. He had been trained in Pittsburgh, working with American glass, opalescent glass, right up to the 1900s, and then he'd moved to Boston, where again he was working with opalescent glass, but he had already made a very detailed study using books from the Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh, the books that I showed you earlier by Westlake and Winston and Lewis Day. He'd made a very intensive study of medieval stained glass. And when he was given the opportunity to design a window for one of Cram's churches, he was obliged to go and be interviewed by the architect who had complete control over what went into his church. This is All Saints at Brookline, again in the Boston suburbs. And at first, Cram was totally skeptical. He said, well, what can possibly good can come out of Pittsburgh, of all places? Of course, the most industrial town in America at the time, and very smoky and polluted. And slowly, Connick explained to him how he had become a devotee of medieval glass. He told him all about the books that he had read, and Cram was hugely impressed by the enthusiasm that he had and his knowledge of medieval glass that he'd never actually seen. He'd only seen these black and white illustrations in books. And by the end of their interview, which was supposed to be just half an hour and ended up being a couple of hours, he handed him a blueprint for the stonework of the window and said, "You've got the contract." So Connick was able to, in fact, he left the studio he'd been working for as a designer and had the window made up, and he painted it and designed the whole thing, and drew the cartoons, etc., chose all the glass. And this is the very first independent window he made in 1910 for Cram's church. But the moment it went in, this is Connick on the right photograph, and you see a detail in the middle of the figure of St. Paul. You'll see that Connick had completely absorbed the medieval tradition from just the books that he'd read. He'd understood about leading. He'd made a close study of medieval architectural forms for the canopy work. In this case, you can see these are clearly based on 14th century canopies. And this window was so successful that with the money that he was given for the commission, and also with a loan from Ralph Adams Cram, he was able to visit Europe for the very first time and to see for himself stained glass. And he went with an introduction from Cram to Christopher Whall. I think this is highly significant because the first person he really went to see in London was Christopher Whall, whose work Cram admired so much. Cram had spoken of Wall's Gloucester windows as being at the same time perfectly medieval and perfectly modern. That was really what Cram was aiming for. So Connick arrived in London. He went to Ravenscourt Park in Hammersmith, to the studio, Wall's studio, you see top left. And there he met the man himself and some of his pupils and apprentices. See the women and young men in the studio. And he also saw, when he was there, the sort of arts and crafts philosophy that dominated Wall's studio. He didn't see it as a trade or an industry. He saw it as a vocation, as his book had promulgated, stained glass work, which had been, as I say, published in America. And he also saw that stained glass could be fun, because one of the ways that Wall trained his apprentices was to get them to use very small fragments of cut off pieces of glass to make these little cullet panels, which you see on the left, much smaller than the image on the screen, which is just made out of scrap glass. And with comical subjects, this shows a bird dressed as a policeman and another one as a beggar on the street being arrested. And on the right, the other thing that Connick saw and made contact with in London was the glassmakers, and especially James Powell and Sons, the great Whitefriars glass works, who were perfecting a whole range of new arts and crafts inspired glass from the 1890s onwards under Harry Powell, who'd begun spectroscopic analysis of medieval windows to analyze the color, but also was developing this technique of slab glass to create the wonderful textures that you see there. And when Connick was to return to America, from that point onwards, he obtained all his glass from England. In fact, glass of this sort was not being made in America at all. Well, having toured around England in the summer of 1910, Connick saw not only Christopher Whall's work and the work of Burne-Jones at Birmingham Cathedral, which he hugely admired, but also he began to study real medieval stained glass. It must have been a revelation to him. And he saw it through the eyes, in a sense, of somebody who had already imbibed this arts and crafts philosophy. So he was seeing it not as an antiquarian, but very much as a craftsman and identifying with the work of his medieval predecessors. And he sketched what he saw. On the left, you see one of the famous 12th century figures at Canterbury Cathedral. And in the center, a famous figure from the Beauchamp Chapel in St. Mary's, Warwick. And on the right, when he got to France, he was able to get up high up on scaffolding at Chartres Cathedral. And there he was permitted to make a rubbing of one of the windows in the, I think in the north transept at Chartres, the figure of Jeroboam. And that's a rubbing which he then colored in. So it's an exact same scale drawing of the medieval window. He wrote of that first experience of Chartres. The windows in Chartres formed an active community of color and light that was like a new wizardry of sound, a strange music that was also familiar. And this first European visit had a colossal effect on Connick and was to influence all his subsequent work. He returned to England later to America in 1910 and began working on new commissions, mainly instigated by Ralph Adams Cram, who now saw him as the great new hope for American stained glass. And one of the early commissions was in 1912 for another window in All Saints Brookline. You saw the first one that Connick designed. You'll see the format is very similar. But he's learned a lot from going to Europe. For a start, he's using white glass, more silvery white glass, in the ornamental elements of the window. And he's also using even more saturated color and huge amounts of lead in the figure that you see in the detail on the right, standing against a background pattern, which of course is also derived from French cathedral windows of the 13th century. That's Connick drawing the cartoon for one of the figures you recognize in the window. This is his 1912 window, and this again was a great success. And on the basis of that, Connick was able, again with loans from Ralph Adams Cram, to set up his own studio and work independently and to recruit assistants to work with him. And on the left is number 9 Harcourt Street in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. Originally, Connick's studio was on the right-hand block at the very top. And one of the early visitors there was Isabella Stewart Gardner, who climbed up the stairs, went to see his work in the studio. And as she left, she turned to him and said, "Young man, one day you'll be famous," which must have been wonderful to come from the Boston's most famous art patron of the time. And a lot of artists and writers came to visit the Connick studio, including John Singer Sargent, who of course was working on the murals in Boston Public Library, and many other artists of the time. And you'll see some early photos of the Connick workshop, the interior. On the top right is the glass painting workshop, and the figure actually painting glass at the top is William Francis. He was an Englishman who had been recruited from James Powell and Sons to join Connick as one of his assistants. So there's already a significant English influence in terms of Connick's training and his self-education in stained glass, but he's also now working with people who, and William Francis was a very experienced glass painter from the Powell's workshops in London. And the bottom photograph shows the glazing workshop, where much of the glass, well, in fact, all of those crates of glass would have been from England. So it all had to come across the Atlantic to Connick's studio. A lot of his early commissions were for primarily architectural and decorative glazing in Cram's churches and Goodhue's churches. And I show here how he made good use of sketches he'd done in his 1910 English tour. You see on the left his watercolor of a famous grisaille pattern at Salisbury Cathedral, and Connick's own version of it, virtually a copy, at First Baptist Church by Bertram Goodhue in Pittsburgh. And on the right, again, grisaille glass, partly based on medieval examples, but Connick's own original treatment of it at in the chapel of Bates College in Lewiston in Maine, in the States. And Connick would often use the grisaille patterns that you see here. In fact, virtually always that Salisbury pattern or variations of it as the background for glazing the figures in his windows. On the, well, both the images are from a church in St. Paul, Minnesota, House of Hope Presbyterian Church, where you'll see that he's placed the figures against this grisaille background, often using stenciling, in fact, to do the pattern work on the glass. It was obviously an economic measure with very large windows, but always with varying the tint and using hand brushing over the stencils. So you get a lively kind of feel to the windows as well, and introducing bars of color, bands of color into them. So the figures are rather beautifully integrated into this pattern work. I think particularly you can see the use of slab glass, often very unevenly colored in these jewel-like colors in the right-hand figure of Queen Esther. The arts and crafts influence, very overt arts and crafts influence, is quite explicit in Connick's early work of the 1910s and into the 1920s. On the left-hand side, a part of a window at St. Gabriel's Marion in Massachusetts, where Connick has used that idea that Christopher Whall had developed of a canopy over the figure, an ornamental frame based on foliage. Here he's used a rather nice rose motif. And on the right, you'll see Connick using glass in almost an abstract way, but which has parallels here in England, of using highly textured glass. The center light and top right are from the Ellingwood Memorial Chapel in Nahant in Massachusetts. Again, a building, a very fine building by Ralph Adams Cram. And the bottom right, pieces of slab glass in streaky colors, that's to say where the color is very unevenly applied in the mineral state when the glass is molten. And you can see swirls of uneven color in these pieces. That's at St. Elizabeth's Chapel at Sudbury in Massachusetts, just outside Boston, which was Cram's private chapel. You'll see how Connick is playing with the leading patterns as well, with these little chips of different colors and inserts into the glazing. In 1915, Connick showed his work at the great international exposition, the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, where he was awarded a gold medal for his work, and where one of the journalists commenting on his work described him as the Burne-Jones of America. I think you can see that strong arts and crafts and pre-Raphaelite influence in these details from a major commission, probably the most prestigious so far that Connick gained, again through Ralph Adams Cram. And this was for the bay window in Proctor Hall at Princeton's Graduate College, where earlier William Willett had done that large window. And the subject of the window, completed in 1919, was Mallory's Morte d'Arthur and the quest for the Holy Grail. So in the center, you see King Arthur, and on the right, the detail of the angels with the Grail, the veiled Grail, and with their censers, etc. Again, I think it's quite clear here that he's using this English slab glass. He particularly liked the sort of pale sea green streaky versions of it, but also the very saturated purples and deep blues that you see in the center. And also the emphasis upon lead. The lead is used very expressively, not purely functionally. One wouldn't need to use that amount of lead. So it is in purely functional terms. So it is very much a part of the graphic content of the design. Connick, like Whall, had apprentices and pupils in his studio by the later 1910s. On the left, you see a work by Mary Hamilton Fry, who was already an experienced muralist and book illustrator, an American woman, who decided that she wanted to learn stained glass and went to Connick's studio. And there she learnt the craft of how to construct windows as well as design them. And Connick suggested that she should go to Europe as well. And she spent another 6 months completing her training in Christopher Whall's studio. And the black and white photograph on the left shows her window at La Tuque in Quebec in Canada. And there she's obviously adopted, fresh from Wall's studio, the foliate canopies that I've spoken about. On the right, the two details are of work by Margaret Redmond, again, an experienced painter who had designed in opalescent glass, but then repudiated her earlier work and went to Connick to learn how to use the medieval technique, which you see here. And again, these wonderful slab glass colors, which really are jewel-like. In 1920, 3 of Connick's assistants decided to set up their own studio. And one of them was William Francis, whom I mentioned, who had come to him from England, from James Powell and Sons. And the larger photograph on the left is of William Francis and his 2 partners, Joseph Reynolds and George Roanstock, in the partnership of Reynolds Francis Roanstock, founded in 1921, and a window by them where I think you can quite clearly see that they are using the source books, that this is a slightly later one. This is Hugh Arnold, who'd been a pupil of Christopher Whall, his great book, Stained Glass of the Middle Ages in England and France, which was actually illustrated by an American artist, Lawrence Saint. And it's Lawrence Saint's watercolor of Canterbury glass, which I think was clearly the inspiration for the head that you see in the bishop figure in this Reynolds Francis Roanstock window. Bottom left, you can see George Roanstock selecting pieces of slab glass. I've shown you in previous slides what they look like. And there, he's the glazier member of the firm, and he's selecting particular tints of slab glass in that typical format. They're always quite small pieces. The 9 by 7 or would be the largest, 9 inches by 7 inches would be the largest size. So they're quite small pieces, which are then cut to shape in the window. But Connick had one major rival, at first anyway, based in New York, and he too was British. This is Henry Wynd Young, a Scottish artist born in 1874, trained at Gray's School of Art in Aberdeen, where one of his fellow pupils was Douglas Strahan, the great Scottish stained glass artist. In 1907, Henry Young, later became Henry Wynd Young, he added that to his name, went over to America, and by 1914-15 had set up his own studio, which you see bottom left, as it is now, at 314 West 34th Street, surrounded by skyscrapers. And Young, in many ways, was even more of a medievalist. He was using the same sort of source material as Connick had used. Here is an illustration in the center from Westlake's History of Design in Painted Glass, of an Annunciation at East Harling in Norfolk, and Young's version in the black and white photograph, closely derived from it, which is in an unidentified location. We've not found where that window is. But on the right is one of Henry Wynne Young's windows in Minnesota in St. Paul. And here is a splendid set of 4 lights in a chapel in the second church at West Newton in the Boston suburbs, where Henry Wynne Young has clearly borrowed the figure, the right-hand middle figure, from a famous late 14th century window in New College, Oxford. Here is Westlake's drawing, and you'll see they called it Our Lady of Sorrows in America. And you'll see that Henry Wynne Young has created this sort of arts and crafts version of the original medieval window. The painting is very delicate. The use of almost all of this is in slab glass, in tinted slab glass. So it's not the rich colors that we've seen in some of the other things. But Henry Wynne Young's studio was very strongly influenced by the British arts and crafts movement. His own training in Aberdeen had some of that, but his fellow workers were also immigrants from Britain. One of them was John Gordon Guthrie, who was the son of one of the partners of J&W Guthrie of Glasgow, well-known stained glass firm in Glasgow in the 1890s, 1900s. And Guthrie worked with him along with John Tarbox, who had also emigrated to America and who had worked in Christopher Whall's studio for a number of years. And these artists took with them the Wall idiom, as it were. I mean, this window, which is in the same church as the one we've just seen in West Newton, you'll see that it's almost a parody of Christopher Whall's work in terms of the use of the foliate canopies, the checkerboard patterns in the broken quarries, and the use of uneven, irregular quarries as well in the background. And of course, the very rich coloring of the slab glass in the robes of the figures as well. One of Henry Wynne Young's other assistants was Ernest Lakeman. Now, Lakeman also had a Christopher Whall background because he was the first stained glass scholar at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, the stained glass course which had been set up by Christopher Whall in the early 1900s. So Lakeman too had imbibed all of Whall's philosophy and methods of work and his understanding of materials when he went to America before the First World War, first working in Boston and then moving to New York to be one of Henry Wynne Young's team. And these are 2 details from windows in St. James's Church, Episcopal Church in New York City, showing Lakeman's very distinctive style of design and glass painting, particularly the figure of St. Margaret of Scotland on the right. And John Gordon Guthrie, I mentioned as working in Henry Wynne Young's studio. He designed quite a lot in the later period of Young's studio. Young himself died only in his 50s in 1923, but John Gordon Guthrie carried on at the studio with Lake. The studio is run by Young's widow, and produced windows at St. Bartholomew's in New York City, which you see on the left. And again, this beautifully painted figure of St. Louis of France in St. Vincent Ferrer Church in New York City. Bertram Goodhue said that this was the best stained glass he'd ever seen. He was hugely admiring of it. He was the architect of St. Vincent Ferrer. John Gordon Guthrie went on to have a very successful career independently. He left Young's studio and carried on working into the 1960s, I think. And increasingly, his style becomes, in a sense, a sort of fusion of the arts and crafts idiom with a more modern, almost a collage technique, and with very loose glass painting, as you see in almost the sketched figure, the head of St. John you see on the right. The church, these are in Buffalo's St. John and Grace Church in New York State. But I'm returning to Connick because I think that Connick really embodies, certainly for Ralph Adams Cram, everything that he'd wanted to see in stained glass when he'd written about it in the 1900s and said it was essential to return to medieval principles, but with a vital modern impulse as well. On the left, you see a Connick window from the 1920s, clearly influenced by medieval art. Indeed, I would say probably influenced by brass rubbings and the elongated figure of the warrior saint there. But on the right, one of Connick's really important masterpieces, which if ever you're in Princeton, go to the University Chapel and you will see there the 4 great Christian epics windows, which very tall, large windows with multi-panel scenes in them by Connick. And this is the Mallory window illustrating Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur. And it has an almost expressionistic feel about it. It's very much in the medieval technique, but you have these very dramatic diagonal inscriptions, again, a motif found in late medieval glass, but here used in a more modern expressionistic way. And you'll see in the drawing of the figures, more stylized drawing, increasingly Connick goes away from that more pre-Raphaelite idiom to something that's much more recognizably of the 1920s and 30s. In the late 1930s, he was given a unique opportunity to design all the windows, over 30 windows, some of them huge, about 70 foot tall, in the Heinz Memorial Chapel in the University of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And here, Connick was able to put into practice not only all his love of medieval glass, but also his aspiration for glass to be distinctively American in its subject matter as well. And this is one of a series of windows, many of them with prominent women depicted mainly from the 19th century. This is Dorothea Dix, who was a pioneer in the care of people with mental illness in the Victorian period in America. And it's a splendid depiction of her within a medallion format. And the image in the middle shows Connick's very inventive use of technique. He's using applique lead, in this case, to create the black out of which the red glass shines, because there's a sheet of lead which is pounced with holes, which is then soldered onto the main leads of the window. I hope you can see, where the text Dorothea Dix, if you see that on the window, on the actual window on the left, you'll see this shown in reflected light, of course, to show the leading. And I'm returning now to somebody I showed at the beginning, William Blencowe, that London glassblower and bottle maker, who emigrated to the United States in the 1890s to make glass in the English fashion, and had many unsuccessful attempts until the 1920s, when finally he was able to set up a glass workshop in West Virginia, at Milton, West Virginia, and there to blow his own version of slab glass. And this is one of William Blencowe's blue slab glass bottles. And for the first time, people like Connick could use this material made in America for the first time and not simply imported from England. And my last few slides are of, again, Connick's very inventive use of, on the left, recycled glass from the Boston and Sandwich glass works, which was a 19th century glass factory making glass ornaments and small tableware. A friend of Connick's bought the site of the old factory and started excavating for new building and found tons, literally tons, of scrap glass that had been broken pieces of glass. And Connick then started using these to create small medallions of leaded glass, like this peacock on the left. A very interesting use of recycling of this industrial material, but he recognized that the colors were often just as wonderful as the medieval glass that he so admired. And that peacock panel is about 10 inches tall. And on the right, one of his last works from 1939, which is was in the old public library in Newtonville, where Connick lived, in the Boston suburbs. And it illustrates a well-known poem by Robert Frost, who was Connick's great friend, Mending Wall, which some of you may know, has the line, "Good fences make good neighbors." And there you can see his sumptuous use of the types of glass that had been developed mainly in England, but also by now in America. And also the modernist sort of swing in the syncopation of the leading, which is found in his later work. Right. Final slide, Emily Dickinson from the, Connick was a great admirer of, avid reader of poetry, and she features in one of the windows in the Heinz Memorial Chapel and on the cover of my book, which Martin mentioned in the introduction. I hope that that has introduced to you perhaps a subject which sadly you don't yet see in American museums, but I hope one day you can, but certainly which can be seen in many, many wonderful buildings throughout America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. That's certainly for me completely opened my eyes to a set of material that was completely unknown to me before. So thank you so much. Can I, before opening the floor for questions and comment, just ask one myself to kick things off. Does this tradition completely die out in the sort of second half of the 20th century, or is there a continuing?
Well, to some extent, the Second World War really marks a critical point when the generation of modern Gothic architects were mostly dying off or at the end of their careers. And that, I think, meant that the demand for this type of stained glass was changing. In fact, the Connick studio went on right to the 1980s as Connick Associates. He left his own studio in Boston to his workforce. They carried on working till the 1980s, producing work in essentially a developed form of what we've seen in the later work. But of course, abstraction started to come in and modern architecture, and this style of work clearly didn't fit into that.
Does the glass, the manufacture of this type of glass still?
Yes, although in this country, now I think there's only one small firm that is still producing it. And most stained glass artists working here reliant on either French or largely German manufacturers who are producing wonderful work, but not perhaps of the rich. I think in the 1900s, we were producing the best glass in the world for this purpose.
Thank you. Open it up for questions and comments from the floor.
I suppose kind of jumping off of what you were just talking about, I'm curious about the benefits of this kind of slab glass for this kind of stained glass in particular, like what kind of aesthetic it provided that wasn't in the glass that was being produced in America?
Well, the first, the luminosity that was a critical element. I mean, the opalescent glass did not, if you go to a church full of Tiffany windows, for example, on a dull day, it's a bit like going into a dirty swimming pool. The glass is very, very obscure. It doesn't catch the light. If you go into a church with, say, Connick's windows, even on a dull day, they glow and they glitter. Because of the transparency of the glass, it may be quite heavily painted in a textural way, but there's enough of those spots of light that keep the windows alive. The Tiffany windows really do go quite dead on a dull day. So that's one of the reasons. I think also the fact that the glass was made in small pieces from those bottles, where the largest dimension would be 9 inches in height. It meant that, and within that, you get a great variation of thickness. And the thickness, of course, will be reflected in the density of the color as well. It sort of enforced a way of working, which meant more lead was used because it's quite heavy glass, so structurally it needed more lead. And the contrast between this dark matrix of lead and these very, very rich jewel-like colors, rather like the setting of arts and crafts jewelry, really, is a close parallel there. And it has this forcefulness, which perhaps earlier glass, even quite a lot of late medieval glass, doesn't have that intensity that the early medieval glass has because of the smaller pieces.
Any further questions or comments?
Thank you. It's a very interesting, enjoyable talk. I'm just wondering about something about the bigger picture. So how far did the influences that you've traced today on glass, did it spread into other media? I'm thinking particularly book illustrations. You just touched on jewelry, but I was wondering, yes, wider.
Well, yes, I think in terms of the arts and crafts movement, there is a sort of common language that you'll find across different media, certainly in Britain and to some extent in America as well. The arts and crafts movement as a phenomenon in America is very diverse and very regional. So, for example, what was going on the West Coast was strongly influenced sometimes by Japanese art, whereas what was going on in Boston and New York tended to be quite Anglophile, as we've seen. Yes, there is a common language, particularly book illustration. You'll have seen how graphic some of the work is, that Holy Grail window at Princeton. And that, is reminiscent of the style of book illustrations of the period. There's a famous set of Arthurian book illustrations done by, I think it was Howard Pyle, the American book illustrator, which was done in the 1910s. And you'd see close parallels there with the stained glass work. So yes, there is a common arts and crafts language. It's not really a style. Sometimes people talk of it as a style. It goes deeper than that, and it's more eclectic in a way, but also something that's deeper than just a kind of historicist style.
Thank you. Did any of Connick's work come back over to Britain or Europe? Was anything commissioned over here?
Very sadly, there was a project, which would have been a wonderful project in the 1920s for Connick. It was a professor at Harvard who realized that there was an anniversary for Lewis Carroll's, I think the centenary of his birth. And he got together funding to commission a window which would have gone into the church at Croft-on-Tees, which I think is near Darlington in the north, where Lewis Carroll had been brought up. His father had been the vicar or rector there. And Charles Connick designed a beautiful window, and the sketch design survives, which had the figure of Jesus as a child, and then smaller figures of children, including African-American children, and then some of the characters from Alice in Wonderland, the White Knight, etc. And yet all sort of done in this vaguely sort of 13th century blue and red style. And sadly, the diocesan authorities in York decided it was not serious enough and they rejected it. And that would have been, I mean, it would have been a magnificent window, I think. But the only other piece of Connick stained glass that I know of, apart from a couple of bits in private collections, small panels, is a very, very tiny little piece of glass, literally a piece of glass, in the church at Selsey in Sussex, where after the war, one of their vicars was an American, and he gave a little gift of glass from the Connick studio, and it's set into one of the windows. But it's, I mean, it's literally that size, sadly.
Well, please.
I have a question about gender, because you mentioned a few female artists, and I was wondering how welcome women were as artists and craftsmen in this era.
Is certainly in Britain, there were a huge, I mean, I could have given you a lecture on women stained glass of the arts and crafts movement, on which I've written quite a lot. There were a lot of them, and Christopher Whall was very enlightened in his teaching. As you saw, he had a number of women assistants and pupils, and his own daughter Veronica took over his studio in Hammersmith and worked till the 1950s. And in America, Connick likewise had a similar approach. He had quite a number of women working in his studio as assistants, and then they'd go on to have independent careers of their own. I mentioned Mary Hamilton Fry and Margaret Redmond, and there were others as well, working in other studios, not just in Connick's studio. I think we had more here in the UK, actually, than there were in America, but certainly there were in. One of the great things about the arts and crafts movement was that because it was based on practical craft teaching in art schools, and for the first time in the 1890s, women tended to be admitted to these classes. This is the era of the new woman, etc. You do get a whole generation of women going into stained glass as an alternative to just painting pictures for galleries.
Thank you. There's one.
Thank you very much. That was a really fascinating lecture. I wondered, I've done a little work on stained glass in the sort of post-war, First World War period, and quite a lot of the commissions were for memorial windows for people who'd died in the war. But none of the windows you showed us in America seemed to be war memorial windows. I wondered if there were such things. Or...
Oh, yes, there were, and in fact, I mean, there are quite a few, but nothing like as many, because, of course, America only entered the war in 1917 and really was only actively engaged from early in 1918 in any number at all. And then they made a huge and decisive contribution. But there are war memorial windows. And in fact, the Holy Grail window because it was not completed until 1919 at Princeton, it was often seen as a war memorial window because quite a lot of Princeton young men had died in the war or had served in the American Expeditionary Force. But if there'd been time, I think I'd have mentioned that actually the fact that young Americans went over to France and there saw French stained glass, medieval stained glass, and indeed came to this country as well, that was one of the things I think that was a determinant in this change of taste, because they saw how wonderful they looked in the French cathedrals. And they wanted glass that looked similar to that. If you go to Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, for example, which is an entirely 13th century style building, like Notre Dame in Paris, but made of concrete, reinforced concrete because of the earthquake they had in the 1900s. The glass there, which is all by the main glass by Charles Connick, is very much in a wonderful 13th century style, very rich color. And that, I'm sure, in fact, one of the windows incorporates a little fragment of glass from Reims Cathedral, which had been brought back by one of the doughboys, one of the American soldiers. And Connick was asked to glaze it into one of the figures that he made for the church, so for the cathedral. So yes, there are some very fine war memorial windows. Actually, I just didn't. I could have shown many more.
We've had a fantastic discussion, which I think illustrates the way in which Peter has inspired us this evening. Can we thank Peter again for his... I give notice the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 10th of April, 2025, when we'll hear a paper, George Shaw, Entrepreneurial Architect, Antiquary Forger, by Dr. Peter Linfield, Fellow. The meeting stands adjourned. There's a reception outside. Please do join us. Splendid.